like to call this meeting to order. Do I do the second? Okay.
First item of business.
First item of business.
Probably minutes.
The approval of the minutes.
I move that we approve January 14th minutes.
Second.
All those that vote in favor?
Aye.
Those against?
Me too.
Moving
I thought I was
forward,
going crazy.
Our discussion item today is cybersecurity. Superintendent Decker.
Yeah, I just leaned over and told Adam I wanted to say something nice about him first. So please give me a moment to do that. Yeah, you're also going to get phone calls here that shows that we've canceled school tomorrow. So that's what you're beeping from me. So we let those go at 5 so we could get the bus drivers to get kids home before that news came.
Before they start
they were,
celebrating on
yeah,
the
before
bus?
they started their celebrations on the bus. So school is canceled tomorrow. There it is right there, the call. But I wanted to take a minute and thank Adam and his team for this work, but I know a lot of it's driven by Adam. And so with all of that work, nothing's necessarily going to guarantee, of course, or totally keep us safe from some kind of a cybersecurity threat. But I'm very grateful and thankful for what Adam has brought to us and his knowledge and skill in this and his willingness to find out more to do this, because I think it's an easy one to take for granted. And it creates some difficult conversations for us about the way we need to act or behave differently about some things, but they've done a really great job of trying to stand up a defense wall here for us and make sure that we're being as safe as possible from this. And as he's going to share, it's a very real threat, right? I mean, it's happening very consistently and something we all should be concerned about. So with that, go ahead.
I'd say on behalf of employee groups, I just echo that.
Thank
I mean,
you.
because it isn't meant for people's lives, it's massively disruptive. Folks that we talk to in other districts who have had it happen, it really affects their entire life.
Brings you
So
to
I
a
appreciate
standstill.
it.
So,
Yeah.
yep.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm going to be going through a little bit of a program recap just to share where we're at, then a little bit of detail there, and then talk about where we're headed right now and some of the work that we're currently doing in this area. Before I jump in, though, to the overview, I actually want to just reinforce what Brady just shared, and that's, you know, for us, we look at this as work that is critical in terms of protecting our district operationally, protecting our district reputationally, and in other ways. We've seen school districts that have had to pay millions of dollars in ransom payments. We've seen districts that have closed school for over a week. You know, I had a CFO from a peer district of ours who commented to me after a major attack, and he wasn't being facetious, that he would have rather had one of their schools burned down than deal with the fallout of a major cyber attack, because it was so disruptive to their system for actually years beyond the incident itself. So those are all reasons that we do this work. The other reason, though, is that we have an obligation to protect the data, the privacy of our students and of our staff. And so to that point, you know, that's another thing that really drives us here, is that we have access to all sorts of information as it relates to our students families, to our staff. That's financial information, it's other personally identifiable information, and so it's critical to us that we're protecting that. And so that's really why we are doing this work. I want to provide a quick overview. Some of you were involved in this from the inception, but we first presented this plan as a comprehensive cybersecurity plan in, I believe, June of 2023. And following that presentation to the board, implemented a VCISO program, that's Virtual Chief Information Security Officer program. We implemented a unified management platform that brought, I believe it was 5 separate platforms under one platform umbrella, which is huge for security for multiple reasons. One, it allows us to implement things like device management with greater fidelity, because it's in the same place as our support ticketing system. It's in the same place that we're keeping our asset inventories, things like that. But then it also allows those systems to talk to each other because they're all under the same umbrella. So we're able to flag if there's a network scan that yields some vulnerability for a device and a support ticket comes in, the technician looking at that support ticket can immediately see if the device in question also has any vulnerabilities that have been identified by the network scan. So just an example of kind of how that works. And then a handful of other specific improvements that I'll talk about. This work is largely funded through SAVE. We have tapped a couple of other sources of funding. It hasn't been general fund driven, with the exception of the staff time to implement it, as is always the case. And one of the other things that I'll point out is that the work is really necessary because we've actually, over the past few years, always been kind of one step ahead of our insurance requirements. So we implement something, and then within a year or two, we find out that it's required for us to obtain cybersecurity insurance that we have implemented that thing that we already did. So we have yet to come across a requirement that our insurance providers have given us that we weren't already doing. But at the same time, we have had a number of those cases where we had just implemented something and then only to find out that it was going to be required anyway. As it relates to insurance, I will just let you all know so that you're aware we do have cybersecurity liability insurance. I'm not going to say how much we have, and I highlight that in part just to share that throughout this conversation there are a number of details that I'm not going to go into as it relates to particular amounts, costs, platforms, providers. And the reason for that is that this is a public meeting and we don't want somebody knowing exactly what and who to attack. So there are a number of reasons that we keep those confidential. And by Iowa law, we're allowed to keep those confidential. So if at any point the board wants more detailed information, we can go into closed session for that purpose. And then I note here that we have had no significant cybersecurity events, but there are a few things that I want to go into with some detail on that. One is that we have cybersecurity events all the time. Every year we're attacked tens of thousands of times, whether that's in the form of phishing emails or attempts at denial of service attacks or other types of attacks. We constantly have attackers probing our network from the outside to try to figure out if there are vulnerabilities, and we see those. When we collect our reporting through our firewall, through other systems, we see those attacks. We can look into our email filtering platform and see how many messages were marked as dangerous and prevented from being delivered. And then we're also keeping track all the time through our support ticketing system of those messages that are phishing attempts that do actually get through to end users. And then we take steps every single time we get one of those reports. So we are attacked all the time. We've not had a significant compromise event that I'm aware of in the history of the district, certainly not since I've been here. That's not common. We're one of the only ones of the 10 largest districts in Iowa that hasn't had a significant event within the last 10 years. And so on one hand, we feel good about that. On the other hand, we know that if someone really wants to attack us, they will probably succeed. What we do, because schools can only afford really to do this, is to spend our resources as wisely as we possibly can to make ourselves as unattractive a target as possible. So when we talk about cybersecurity attackers, I think people often picture like someone in their basement just like going after someone. In reality, more often than not, this is a business decision. It's a group, overseas that is looking at potential targets and presenting a business case. And if they look at us and they say, well, we probed them and they have this in place and this in place and this in place, hopefully we're just thrown off the pile because they say it's going to take too much work to get through this. We're going to go find somebody else who's not as well protected. Over the past 9 years, so 2016 to 2022, attacks against schools increased by about 400% over that period. We have seen that level off over the past year and a half or so. And data is always, there's a little lag there. But we've seen that level off, but it's still a substantial issue with a lot of districts experiencing compromise events recently. So with all of that said, our cybersecurity program really has 5 core pieces, and I'll go into some detail about each of these just so you know what we're doing. The first I'll start with is network protection. This is probably the most basic. When people think about cybersecurity, you think about firewalls and you think about preventing someone from breaking into your network and accessing resources, stealing data, taking over devices, spreading malicious software, that sort of thing. And so to that end, we have those basic elements, which would include things like firewall, in-place, and vulnerability scanning. That can take a few different forms. So we have vulnerability scanning in a couple different ways. One, you think about antivirus. We use something called XDR, which is looking at a wider array of things than just are there viruses on computers, but is there suspicious activity between devices on the network? Is there suspicious activity within data stores on devices, things like that. We also have network monitoring in place, so we know when somebody attempts to do something that they shouldn't. By that, I don't mean access a website that they shouldn't, but I mean if we have somebody who's on a student device who attempts to directly access a server remotely, we know that. That gets flagged, and we look into, is this something that's repeated? So for example, every now and then we'll have a situation where we need to look into it quickly and more deeply, because we'll see a lot of suspicious traffic all of a sudden from like one computer to a server or something like that. 99% of the time it's benign, but we get those warnings, we follow up on them right away so that we know if something's unfolding as soon as possible. And then threat detection as well. So beyond all of those other elements, just are there certain patterns in traffic that's attacking us that we need to be aware of? One thing I'll note is that we don't monitor this all ourselves. So we have an MXDR service, so it's managed. So there is a 24/7, 365 security operations center that's monitoring all of the logs generated by these services. And so their eyes are on it all the time. We might catch something, they might catch something. Sometimes, oftentimes, we catch them both at the same time. So we're really keeping on top of that. In terms of training, so I put this up number 2 in part because, the two most important cogs in your cybersecurity program are, on one hand, the technical side, protecting your network, making sure that when someone scans and tries to attack, they're going to get blocked. Number 2, though, is people. And that's probably where your biggest vulnerability is somebody, you can have the best firewall in the world, but if somebody emails Nick and says, hey Nick, would you wire me $1 million? And Nick has the ability to do so, which he doesn't, in case anyone was worried.
But you can click on
But,
it. So you should click on it.
but if Nick doesn't know that he should be suspicious of this, if he doesn't know to check where the email is coming from, to follow up via something other than a reply email with the person claiming to send it, if he doesn't know that he can reach out to our help desk to get help, that sort of thing, that can become a real problem for us. And so that's one of the things that we do provide is every single staff member and every student in, I believe it's grades 6 and up, but I need to double check that, receives cybersecurity education and training. For staff members, it's every year. I don't think it's every year for students, but it is at some point during multiple times during their secondary career.
Quick question.
Mm-hmm.
Don't you require that for board members?
We do require it for board members as well. Yep. So we're really trying to protect everybody and make sure that everybody at least has a baseline awareness. The other thing that we do is we test people. So moving down to the regular evaluation, so we engage in at least quarterly phishing simulations. We do not announce when these are happening. In fact, there is only one person in the entire district who knows when one is kicked off, and it's an administrative assistant within the technology department. So she kicks off a phishing simulation, and per recommendation from our provider, we kind of ramp those up. So we start with a baseline, and then we adjust the difficulty throughout the year. So what we're really looking for is a couple things. On the macro level, we're looking for what our percentage of vulnerable users is. So do they open the message? Most people open the message, and there's not necessarily a problem with that. Not everybody has the ability to reasonably preview something. So do they open the message? We get a report on that. Do they click on a link within the message? We get a report on that. And then if they click on a link, do they submit any information there? And we get a report on that.
Yeah.
What you'll probably be happy to know is that our rates for at least 2 years, every quarter have been well below industry averages in terms of our percentage of staff who are marked as being vulnerable to phishing.
How bad are industry averages?
So it depends on the it depends on the difficulty level, to be
Yeah.
honest. Like, very few people will click on something that's really rudimentary,
Yeah.
but a sophisticated attempt that uses, in fact, Nick has been used multiple times.
I was selling a piano.
Yep. So he'll get used.
I asked for a lot of information
Yeah.
from people.
I have,
Yeah.
I have 2 different emails saying from President Ruthina Malone in my
Yeah.
junk email right now.
Yep. So things like that, and some of those, so our simulation service will actually do that. They'll have convincing messages that look real. And so for those, industry average is about 10 or 11% within education who will click on those things. For us, our highest rate we've ever recorded was 2.3. So we've been substantially better. Generally, we are lower than that. Generally, we're between 1% and 2% who click. And then we do follow up with individuals who click on those. If somebody is identified as susceptible to consecutive simulations, then we follow up directly with them and have a conversation and require them to do additional training.
It should just be a picture of you that pops up as soon as they click on that link. Why?
What are you doing?
I will say, when we turn up the difficulty level all the way, which is always, we do that 1 quarter per year, and when we do that, it's always kind of interesting because those are tough to identify. And so, the fact that we still don't go above 2%, or it's either means nobody checks their email, or it means that people are starting to get it and being suspicious when they should be.
I mean, I think I told you this in the past, that I think that testing
Mhm.
is something that everybody should do, including my employer.
Yep.
And I just got one from a local nonprofit this week where you could tell that the person had been.
Oh yeah, I got that one too.
You may have
Yep.
gotten it from the same place.
Yep.
Mhm.
But,
We do have a couple other ways that we evaluate our program. One is incident response tabletops. We actually have one coming up in a week or so. And so what happens here, it's kind of like D&D for cybersecurity. So we bring in an outside expert who has a scenario in mind. Yes, Dungeons and Dragons. I should have clarified.
For those who
Um,
don't know that very well.
Yep. So it's essentially role playing, right? And so you bring everybody around the table. We'll bring in, typically for these, the entire technology department. We'll bring in any member who wants to attend from the district safety committee, handful of other people who are identified with roles in the incident response plans, disaster recovery plans. And then what they do is they just start to tell a scenario, and individuals around the table who are in relevant roles share how they respond. And so, the scenario might start out with a ticket coming into the help desk reporting one thing. Okay, based upon that, you would receive that. What do you do? They talk through it. We go, it lasts all day. We get some really good feedback from those, both from the expert who's leading it, as well as from our own team, as we identify there's this question or this thing happened, and we're not sure what the answer is or what we should be doing or who does it. That's something we need to go back and strengthen in policy and procedure. So we do those at least twice a year. Last year we did 3 of them. This year, this one will be our second, but I think we're going to have a third as well. We do penetration testing. That's external and internal. So basically it's ethical hackers who we encourage to attack our network and try to figure out ways to access whatever they can. The external pen tests we passed with flying colors 3 years in a row. That's great. The internal ones have identified major vulnerabilities every single time. I'll throw in a caveat. We give them a little more access than they would have if they simply brought a device and plugged into our network. So the fact that they're able to get around and identify vulnerabilities, partially we just want them to be able to do that, but it's much more likely that they would be able to find those than an actual hacker would. But either way, they've identified vulnerabilities every time we get a report, and then we work to resolve those and make sure that in the future, when they come in, if they try to do the same things, they won't be able to. So,
Where do you find these ethical hackers?
cybersecurity consulting companies.
Okay.
Yep. So they call them red teams.
They
and
considered red hats?
yes,
for that, okay.
yep. So we do those tests, and each time it's kind of nerve-wracking to see what they're going to discover, because it's always interesting, but it's really good information. And then also external review of policies, procedures, and of what we're doing within the program. So we do that on a regular basis through our VCISO program. Policies and procedures, we're always working to develop those. I'll give a caveat about board policy in just a minute. But that includes things like a risk register. So once a month, there's a group of us who come together with someone from our external company, and we basically go through a list of every cybersecurity related risk we have identified in the past. We talk about where we're at with that, where our progress is towards resolution, whether it's changed in severity or likelihood. And so we go through that, we identify new risks that have come up. And the idea behind that is that, A, we're constantly holding ourselves accountable for, we've identified this, we need to fix it. Some things take a long time to fix, I'll just say that. Sometimes you identify a risk, and it may be 12 months before it's completely resolved. But at the same time, we're constantly reviewing those. And then it prevents anything from slipping through the cracks. We're not going to identify a risk and never get around to it. Similarly, we're always working to update incident response plans, disaster recovery. We're right in the middle of an update to our business impact analysis. So these are all different. Incident response, something happens, how do we respond? That all needs to be documented. The idea being that if I'm out and a couple other key people are out, someone should be able to grab this document and follow it and execute it with fidelity. So that's the idea. So we have an incident response plan. Disaster recovery plan is after the incident. Then what happens? What's the order of state steps and order of priority for getting things back online? Business impact analysis. Like I said, we're in the middle of updating that right now, and that's a really deep understanding of when something happens, what are all the things we need to know are impacted? That includes instructional activities, that includes financial activities, that might include technology activities, other types of areas. We want it to be comprehensive. So we know that if there's an incident with a denial of service attack that impacts our internet connection, who all needs to be communicated to, because who all is going to be impacted in the mission critical sense. So we work to update that. And then also our data governance framework is something that we've begun work on, I'd say 6 months ago. And that's a framework to really have a clear idea of what are our definitions of data and classifications of data within the organization. How do we make sure that access to those is controlled effectively? From a policy perspective, so assigning permissions to resources, for example, and then how do we audit those effectively? So that's another thing that we've done for a long time, but now we're working to formalize it. And then finally, kind of along those lines, authentication and access. So managing account provisioning and auditing. We moved a couple of years ago to role-based permissions for almost everything. So it used to be that, we'd get a request from a building like, hey, so-and-so is really good at doing this thing, so could you give them access to this? Well, now, unless their role actually requires it, it's not something we'll provide access, because that becomes the Wild West when you start to have people change roles and you didn't realize that so-and-so had access to sensitive information that you never would have guessed. So things like that, things like making sure that when someone changes positions, leaves the district, their access is immediately restricted. Permissions controls to that end. Multi-factor authentication you're all familiar with, I'm guessing, and that's something that has been an insurance requirement for years. We started doing that probably 5 years ago. And then password security. Our staff are really excited about the length of passwords we require. But it all comes down to ultimately following best practices. And so one of the practices that we've received from the federal government is we don't necessarily want to have extreme complexity requirements. That's not that helpful because then everyone writes their passwords down or uses the same one over and over. What we want is very long passwords that are incredibly difficult for computers to break and can be very easy to remember if you use passphrases. Like, you know, I always use the example like, I really love tacos. If you put that into a site to figure out how long it would crack, it would take like 1 billion years. And the reason is that it's long. It's really easy. It's not complex, but it's long. And so a computer would have a hard time getting to that one.
What would happen if someone gets my password?
So good question. So if someone were to get your password, we have controls in place that limit your access along with everybody else's to things that you need access to. So if they got your password, they would immediately have access to any data you have stored on your computer if you were on the network, because they can remote into it potentially. Because of multi-factor authentication, they wouldn't necessarily get access to like your Google Drive or your Gmail, because when they try to log in with your password, it would try to send a notification to your phone. And so there's another layer of protection even if that were stolen. But then let's say they were able to log into your computer here on the network. Potentially, if you had that multi-factor authentication, saved on your computer, they might be able to access Google. They might try to access certain servers, although for most of you around the table, that wouldn't do a whole lot because those are so restricted for us. So we put a lot of layers in place. I will say when they've done internal penetration testing, they've compromised user passwords every single time. Not everybody's, so don't panic. But they have found some user passwords that they've compromised every time. We've gotten much better at getting feedback that, hey, we were able to obtain these passwords. We tried to do these 15 things and we weren't able to do any of them. So that's good.
Is your password, I really love tacos?
Because that's a strong password. All right.
No, it isn't. I don't.
All right, program maturity. So as I mentioned, we have an evolving regulatory and insurance landscape. We never know when we go year to year with our insurance renewals whether we're going to be required to have something more in place than we've had in the past. And we don't find that out until we actually get the feedback from our application each year. So that's something that I feel pretty good that we're going above and beyond right now, but something we want to keep an eye on. From a regulatory sense, one of the things that we've seen come up much more just within the last 2 years is things like grant programs. So we applied for a grant program with an external partner for an NSF grant, and we had to certify all sorts of cybersecurity elements that we had in place on our network. So it's something that comes up. Policy development, so like I said, working on that business impact analysis and the data governance framework, those are what are on the agenda right now. Once we finish those, we'll circle back to those others because nothing's ever finished, right? Everything needs to be reviewed, tested, and then revised. I had mentioned that there was a caveat about board policy. We don't bring a ton of cybersecurity related policies to the board beyond some basic ones that already exist in board policy, in large part because much of this information is confidential. So things like a disaster recovery plan, even though it might provide some people peace of mind to know we have one, we don't want that publicized. We don't want our incident response plan publicized for probably some obvious reasons in terms of people attacking, knowing how we're going to respond and what to anticipate. We do engage in monthly evaluation, as I said, and scheduled mitigation of risks, ongoing testing and improvement of our disaster recovery and incident response procedures through primarily those tabletops and other exercises. I had mentioned the password policy in terms of a best practice element where we're constantly getting feedback from a couple different groups. The federal government has a division and then a couple of consortia that we're a member of provide information about best practice, and those change. And so we're constantly on the lookout for, we thought this was the thing to do, and then they come out with guidance that actually we need to shift and look at something else. So We try to stay on top of that. And then the other thing that I wanted to share with you is we have been advocating through the UEN. We actually just drafted, we here in Iowa City drafted a memo and sent it to the UEN, encouraging them to lobby for greater flexibility to expend management fund resources on cybersecurity efforts.
So the only way we can fund it is through SAVE right now then, and general fund, or?
Pretty much. We can fund through SAVE, PEPAL, or general fund. We can fund our cybersecurity insurance through the management fund. And for whatever reason, we are allowed to fund an asset inventory through the management fund. But right now, the state has drawn the line at the asset inventory and said no other cybersecurity related activities are allowable. I believe, because this is so closely tied to risk, that that should be expanded, so that's what we are encouraging.
But I assume that there, and rightfully so, that there probably are cybersecurity requirements from the state, or are they not?
There are minimal requirements from the state. Most of the requirements are requirements of what we need to do in the event that we have already been compromised. The state does not have specific requirements other than, you know, make your best effort to protect data kind of things as it relates to how we need to protect our networks, protect our data, that sort of thing.
So that's probably where they get the ability to not fund it.
Yeah.
But insurance is who's making it, well,
Right, and ultimately, if we were to be compromised and we had to pay something like a ransom, we'd look at the management fund, right? And so, you know, I'd argue that this probably saves money in the long run, but either way, that's the argument we've been making. So. That's the presentation. I'm happy to address any questions that anyone has.
No, I think you're doing a great job in making sure we are protected on all fronts. Like I said, we're even doing things that other big employers are not. So, good job.
Appreciate it.
no couple around town?
Just go.
Just couple. No, thank you. Any questions from the board members that anybody else would like to ask, or thoughts, opinions? Okay, waiting for a motion for adjournment.
Second,
All in favor?
aye.
Aye. Those hands? No? Meeting is adjourned.
Thanks, guys.
Everybody at 6:00.